I'm going to turn now to looking at several young emerging artists, so a different group of artists than the ones that we've been just looking at. Liu Di, who's someone who's starting to really make a name for himself, he's approximately 30 years old, is really interested in the new China, in a sense, that he has grown up in, and that he is, taking up his adult responsibilities in. He was born in 1985, and one of the things that he's especially concerned about is urban blight and the tension between nature and modernization. These emerging artists tend to have really different interests and concerns than the group that I have just talked about, because they're of a different generation. Their personal history in China is different. Their memory is different as well. So let's take a look at the picture on the left and play the what's wrong with this picture game. If someone in China were to see this picture of a Chinese city, they would not recognize it, because the sky is never that blue. The buildings are never that clean. The streets are never that empty and open. What you're more likely to encounter is what you see on the right. And yet, the way China is explained to many people is that vision that you see on the left. So Liu's work is really interesting in that he's trying to address this kind of tension, the truth and the fiction of China for most of the Chinese people, and especially for those who live in these urban centers that have been growing like wildfire over the last couple of decades. So he presents using Photoshop in these photographs of blighted urban areas that are everywhere, these gigantic creatures that represent nature, but a kind of nature that seems like it has somehow been deformed by its environment in some sort of way. Not only is it monstrous in size, but it also has lost some of its original integrity. Here's another example, just so that you get a sense of the range of what he's doing, where these creatures seem truly out of place in their environment. And then he also produces works like these with human figures that are incredibly vulnerable and not just a little bit grotesque. Liu uses the very means of commercial salesmanship and deception, like that blue sky cityscape that I showed you at the beginning, Photoshop, to engage in a critique of the Communist Party's promotion of a harmonious and prosperous society, the promise that is being made to the Chinese people, but where only a few are actually benefiting from it. Another young artist, Hua Tunan, who is only 25, but is considered one of the rising stars of the Chinese art world, is working in a very, very different direction. He was trained in Singapore in classical Chinese art and illustration, and is a member of a group called the Edge Creative Collective, which is an exclusive collection of Chinese artists who represent the best in class of different styles of artwork from all of the Chinese art academies. And it is a collective that connects these artists with large corporate clients. So in a very real way, it is a commodification of art. So this is a very different strain of what's happening in the art world in China. What's interesting about Hua is that he originally became known for his graffiti art, and that's a part of his really distinctive style. So he does things that look, very much like graffiti art and murals in various cities, but now does them as commissions, and for very high prices, incorporating Chinese imagery and symbols like the dragon here, and the kind of splatter work that is a hallmark of Zen Buddhist ink painting. So he's drawing on that traditional training, but moving it into a very kind of contemporary mode and merging the work with aspects of Western graffiti artists as well. Here we see him working with a bunch of traditional Chinese brushes on the detailing of this particular piece. And he also takes landscapes like this that have a rootedness in traditional Chinese landscape, but transforms them with this kind of psychedelic color. But increasingly, he's moving in the direction of working for major international corporate clients, such as Lexus, where here he was hired to work on one of their promotional campaigns in China. And so he's using that graffiti style to paint not only the car, but also the backdrop in order to create a kind of marketing campaign that will appeal to the Chinese elite who can afford these kinds of vehicles. These are a few of his other projects. But Hua is recognized as one of the leading young forces in the world of Chinese street art, and also as one of those people who is combining Western graffiti styles with traditional Chinese methods in very, very distinctive kinds of ways. But again, he's most well known for his collaborative illustrative work with these brands from around the world: Louis Vuitton, Adidas, Nike, Jaguar, Volvo, Das Auto, Subaru, Disney, and Lenovo, because there's an enormous market for these things in China today. The last young emerging artist is someone I encountered in 2006 when she was featured in Art News as one of the young artists to watch. Her name is Charwei Tsai, and she is Taiwanese. But from a Chinese position, she is without a doubt Chinese and someone that they would own. When I was preparing for my first trip to China, I asked a seasoned colleague who had lived in China for over 25 years what I should be careful not to ask about, knowing that there were areas of sensitivity. And he said, just avoid the 3 T's: Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan. Not only does China consider Taiwan a part of the People's Republic, but so do most Chinese people, because that is what they're taught. It appears as a part of China on all of their maps, and foreign teachers have even been expelled from the country just for showing a map in a classroom that represents Taiwan as a separate entity. So I thought it would be good to include someone from Taiwan. And besides, she's one of my favorite artists from this part of the world. When I received this issue of Art News, I was intrigued immediately with the image of an iris with Chinese characters drawn on it, and eagerly looked inside to discover who the artist was. I learned that she had apprenticed with Kai Guo-Chang of the spectacular gunpowder paintings and mammoth installation works. Both admit that apart from an interest in ephemera, her work moved in a very, very different direction than Kai's. Inscribing the Buddhist Heart Sutra on fragile, often natural grounds like this flower, or on tofu, which she then allows to decay. It's important to understand the symbolism of the grounds that she uses for these inscriptions. Tofu in Asian countries is a basic nutritional source. So the connection between spiritual and bodily food shouldn't be overlooked as she brings these two things together. Here we actually see a work that helps us to understand the importance of ephemera in East Asian societies in particular. This is a work by the artist Sung Dong that's simply titled Writing a Diary in Water. But it actually represents a really common meditational practice that you see going on in the parks of China almost every day, especially early in the morning, where elderly people will go and they'll come with a big bucket and a large sponge brush, and they will draw characters of important spiritual texts on the paving that then will disappear, as that water evaporates. It represents this idea that things are constantly in a state of transformation, that things are coming into being as they are also disappearing, and represents the kind of cyclical nature of all being in many of the East Asian religions. I also discovered that Charwei Tsai had been included in the first Singapore Biennale, which was on the theme of belief, as I've already mentioned. Her work of the Heart Sutra was written on the leaves of a lotus plant in this instance, which is a symbol of purity and regeneration in several Eastern religions. It was installed in the same Buddhist temple as the rug by Shubing, but her work is intimate, almost unassuming in nature, in contrast. Although she wasn't particularly religious as she was growing up, she did memorize the Heart Sutra as a child. And the Heart Sutra equates emptiness with enlightenment, suggesting that only by being freed from the senses can one be released from suffering. That's maybe some sort of universal truth, she says, but there's another side of reality, and that is the passion that people feel. So I also created another piece for the Biennale Belief, which was composed of the Heart Sutra on lotus seeds, roots, and flowers, which represent the purification of speech, body, and mind, respectively. And then she placed them on the main altar as if they were offerings. She also recreated her tofu mantra at an abandoned military camp nearby as a kind of offering. In more recent work, such as this one, where she's written an inscription as a kind of memorial on a sea biscuit, a memorial to the victims of the tsunami of March 11, 2011. Most recently, her art has extended to reflect her interest in Sufi mystical practice and the whirling dervishes, whose dance represent the planets revolving around the sun. Immersed in their microcosms, the dervishes create new worlds and make contact with eternity. They were a part of an exhibition that was titled "We Came Whirling from Nothingness" in 2014. This exhibition also includes delicate cosmological drawings that have just a little hint of Kai's gunpowder paintings that reflect the cyclic understanding of time and the universe in Buddhism, Taoism, and even Hinduism. Here's another one of those drawings. In the last little bit of time that I've got, I'd like to introduce you to yet another group of artists, and that is artists of Christian faith in China. The church in China has grown like wildfire through the 20th and into the 21st century. In 1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic of China, there were an estimated 700,000 Christians in China. Remember that Christianity and all religious belief and practice would have been banned at that time. By 1979, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, there were an estimated 10 million Christians in China. Today, estimates run from 40 to 120 million, where most people estimate that dividing those estimates in half probably give you a pretty solid guess of the minimum number that you have in China. So perhaps 80 million is a good average at this point. Roughly the same number of people who are members of the Chinese Communist Party. This just gives you a little bit of perspective on how rapidly the Christian church has been growing. One of the distinctive things to also understand is that most members of the unregistered, the so-called house church, in urban centers are first-generation Christians. They don't trace their Christianity back to these earlier populations, but they're new Christians. So I want to introduce you briefly to 3 different artists who are doing very, very different kind of work and who are really trying to be a presence both in the Chinese art world as well as to serve their society in a number of ways. Hu Chunyi, who lives in Beijing, became a Christian as an adult. He was trained in one of the most prestigious art schools in Beijing and is incredibly well connected as a result with major artists working in Beijing today. He's represented by major galleries in China and also in Singapore, and sells his work to a wide range of clients worldwide. He's also a leader of an unregistered church of artists and friends. Very often these churches start out as simply a Bible study where someone who has become a believer starts to invite their friends to learn with them. And all of a sudden they find themselves in charge of a group of 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 people. Each of the artists that I'm showing you today, that's basically their story. Hu Chunyi started out being trained in traditional traditional Chinese techniques and methods, such as lacquer. So the work that you see on this on the screen right now, titled "A Bountiful Harvest," is actually done in lacquer technique. He's considered one of the best artists working in lacquer in China today. And gets commissions from all kinds of businesses in Beijing and other major cities to produce works. And yet you'll notice that this is a highly abstracted work. So he's taking those traditional techniques into a very contemporary mode. But he also likes to just interject little references to his Christian faith. Some of his other work is in 3-dimensional pieces. This is actually an installation of metal chairs that he calls the Last Supper. So you'll notice that there are 12 chairs and then 1 chair at the head. Each of the chairs has a seat of nails, as a reference to the martyrdom and the suffering of those early disciples, and where we see Christ only identified or distinguished as being at the head. What he's trying to do is he's trying to combine Chinese tradition with his Christian faith in some kind of intriguing ways, so that the Christian faith, which is an alien faith from a Chinese perspective, can be embraced and approached a little bit more readily. In that installation, we also have Judas represented. So on the right, you see the Judas chair. And what he's actually done is he's used the ancient form of currency, which are these slugs of silver that look like little boats, to represent the 30 pieces of silver that Judas took when he agreed to betray Christ. This is another work called the China chair. Obviously not another chair that's not intended to be sat on, that brings together a number of really significant Chinese symbols. It's a chair that actually has a lucite pool and recess in the seat in the shape of the country of China that looks a little bit like a rooster. And when this is installed, you have, he places water in that recess with goldfish in it. Most of you have been, I'm sure, to Chinese gardens or Japanese gardens and seen the koi fish that are often in those pools. And you see an image over here. The koi are symbols of good fortune in China. And so, you know, here what he's suggesting is that China is looking for good fortune, and he's wanting to prompt people to think about what really constitutes good fortune. Is it wealth? Is it position? Or is it something else? What's interesting about these chairs is that they may seem quite overt in their Christianity to us, but they're actually purchased by people who have no interest in Christianity, because he's found a language that bridges the kinds of issues that that people are probing, and doing it in some innovative kinds of ways. So he's actually reproduced works like this quite a number of times because of clients who have sought him out for these pieces. Another element of his practice is that's more recent is Chinese ink painting, and reinventing, in a sense, aspects of that ancient medium. And one of the things that he's working with is the Chinese character that means the earth. And one of the things that he realized as he was really thinking about his newfound Christian faith was the fact that the character here, which in China originally began as a pictogram, where the horizontal line at the bottom represents the earth itself, and then the two, what looks like a cross to us, actually represents everything that grows up from the earth and those who walk on the earth. But he also realized that it evokes that image of the cross in such a strong way that he wanted to include it in his work in some fresh kinds of conceptions, in ways that most might not in any way realize what he was suggesting, but there might be some who could. So in this body of work, he's using the symbol of the dragonfly, a creature that in Chinese symbology has what's considered to be a short but very, very joyful life, because they flit all over the place. So it's a symbol of joy, but also of the transience of life itself. And in this case, he's placed that red ink seal that has the character of the earth in between, and those dragonflies being drawn to it. This is another one that's an interesting one because it represents some of the realities of contemporary Chinese society as a result of some of the Communist Party policies, the one-child policy very specifically here, where again he's using the dragonfly and reflecting the father and the mother, and then the one child, you know, that is completing the family there. Here he is probing through using a language that's very much like someone like Mark Rothko in the West, with those washes of color, those impenetrable, you know, veils where they seem to give you a hope of something that you can't quite see, to indicate that struggle that we see in Chinese society today for what to believe in, that so many people are recognizing. And then a last one in this series titled Happy Reunion, all of those dragonflies again. As a kind of hope for a harmonious society, something that is what's being promoted in China, but where most people feel like it's really not being realized. What's interesting about Hu Chunyi's work is that it's primarily purchased by people who have no interest in Christian faith, even though he's interjecting elements of it into his work. Another artist named Guoxin, Shannon, as she goes by to people in the West, works in Shanghai. And she works in really different arenas. She is the founder of one of the major jewelry and metals programs in the country, is considered one of the leading artists in the area of fine art metalwork in China. She's sought after worldwide to actually curate these kinds of exhibitions of her work. And she's also the founder and curator of a gallery called Two Cities Gallery in Shanghai that showcases fine art metalwork and also ceramics. The idea behind Two Cities Gallery is a really interesting one. It actually goes back to ideas that were introduced by James Davison Hunter in his book, To Change the World, where he promotes a new kind of conception for the way that artists and other Christians should be operating in the world, and that is to be a faithful presence in whatever arena that they're working in. And so the gallery, the program that she has developed at Shanghai University, the curatorial work that she does, is primarily geared at simply nurturing the work of all of the artists that she comes into contact there, and creating a kind of hospitable environment for that. And she's also training a sizable proportion of the new artists that are working in these arenas through her position as the director of that program. She also is the leader of an unregistered church that's numbers over 200. So when you're talking about a house church in China, you're not necessarily talking about a congregation that meets in a house or an apartment anymore. Things are changing. So the work that you see below her picture are some of her own pieces, really imaginative and very pictorial, evocative kinds of works. This is the logo for Two Cities Gallery, which references the idea that Augustine introduces the city of God and the city of man, that every city that exists, there are two cities within it. The city of man, and then the city of God, which is the city that it should be becoming. And so Two Cities Gallery is trying to contribute to how the city and the country that China, in a sense, should become. These are more pieces by Shannon, so that you can see the really wonderful, imaginative intricacy of her work. The last artist that I want to talk about is Zhu Yang, who lives and works out of Beijing. He actually works in a center, one of the burgeoning art centers around Beijing that are just growing up overnight, called the Sengzhuang Art Colony, or Art Village, that's on the far outskirts of Beijing. It originally began to attract artists who were new to Beijing, didn't necessarily have much money, needed a cheap place to find studio spaces and to live. But even in just the few years that I started visiting there, from one visit to the next, I would see whole blocks and neighborhoods razed to the ground so that major new buildings that would be galleries and studio spaces for major artists to work in, taking the place of those neighborhoods. So it's an area that is really being transformed. There are at least an estimated 10,000 artists who live and work in this community, which just gives you the sense of the numbers that we're dealing with when you look at any kind of enterprise in China. Zhu Yang is another kind of artist, in a sense, in terms of what he sees as his calling in art. He originally started as a painter, but more recently has turned to installation and performance art as a more fitting means to, in his words, intervene in society through the medium of art. So like many of the artists that we've already looked at today, he's really concerned about some of the social issues and problems of meaning and belief that are plaguing many Chinese today. He very specifically articulates his belief that artists need to reclaim their ancient priestly function. So on the left, you see some of his early paintings, and then his move into performance and installation art with The Stray Lamb. This performance was actually in a gallery where he gathered a huge herd of sheep into a pen, that crowded the gallery with just a little bit of room for the people coming into the space to wander around and observe. And then you'll notice on the left-hand side that there's a lamb that is suspended from the ceiling. And he had a microphone that was attached to that lamb that was very, very kind of frightened, because it was being suspended from the ceiling. And so throughout the space, the buying of the lamb, was kind of echoing through the chamber, and really the dominant kind of element, raising all kinds of questions about being part of the herd of sheep, what it means to be a docile follower, because that's what sheep generally are, but they also have a tendency to stray. And that's something that especially country people in the cities of China are filled with country people who have migrated recently to the city, understand about these things. On the right, we see another part of that installation where one of those lambs has the mask of a wolf on it. And it's a kind of reference, to, again, the idea of the sheep in wolf's clothing or the wolf in sheep's clothing. This question of, do you really know what it is that you're looking at? Can you trust the other? Which is a serious question for many Chinese. Here he also uses the lamb imagery in another performance installation piece to bases covered with sheets that could be beds, they could be altars, you can read them either way. The sheep on the, in the upper image on the one platform has its legs bound as a lamb would be ready for slaughter or for sacrifice. And then on the other platform, a person there whose legs are also bound, where he's raising questions about people's freedoms and what it is that they are subjected to in his society. Another work here is one that is part of a series that he called The Enlightened, and where there was a performance of old men who were being led by a blind man at the front. Each person making contact in some way and really raising that kind of question that the phrase, the blind leading the blind in the West, invokes. And again, raising questions about his own society. The last work that I want to talk about here is, I think, it's his most recent work, and I think actually one of the most significant and provocative, and in a way ties together so many of the things that I've been trying to unveil in the artists and artwork that I've introduced you to tonight. And that is a work that's titled Waiting for the Day of Reconciliation. This work was inspired by a recent criminal case referred to as the Yao Jiaxin case. It was called 1020 by the Xi'an police and was a homicide case involving a college student of the same name. On October 20, 2010, in the middle of the night, in the University District of Xi'an, Yao accidentally hit a pedestrian. When he got out of his car and found the victim, noting down his license plate number, he took out a knife, a fruit knife that he had for a snack in his car, and stabbed him 8 times and drove away, leaving him for dead. While fleeing the scene, he then hit another pedestrian at the entrance to his residence and was surrounded this time by witnesses who detained him and called the police. After the matter was reported by the media, it was a cause of great concern for the Ministry of Public Security in Xi'an. And in January 2011, he underwent a public trial for intentional homicide. On June 7 of that same year, he was then executed via lethal injection in Xi'an. Now, none of this might seem unusual. So why was the artist interested in this case? So he describes what prompted him to take it up in his work. He says, throughout the whole of human history, there has been violence between people of different ethnicities and of different nations, even between governments and their own people. The only way to escape this sort of pain is forgiveness and reconciliation. At first, I didn't think to bring this idea into my work and didn't pay too much attention to the case. But later on, I saw the two sides fighting endlessly during the lawsuit and felt that this event was no longer just a problem that remained between these two families, but rather an indication of a deep-seated sociocultural problem. It was in face an event of collective violence. because the whole of society came to participate in it. It was a media event. I thought the only way to leave behind the injuries one has suffered is forgiveness. But this concept of forgiveness, does it exist in our culture? He said. What helps us understand the feeling of being forgiven? In the end, I decided to create this work. This, in essence, is the question. In China, is there the concept of forgiveness? Many people ask this question. So what Zhu Yang decided to do was to contact the families. First, the father of the hit and run and who murdered the victim that he had hit. And that father refused to see him, said that he would never reconcile with the other family. So eventually he went to the father of the young man who had been murdered. And that father, who was just a farmer, said, reconciliation is always a good thing. Both of our children are gone. Why should we continue to fight? So he was willing, but the other father was not. So Zhu Yang decided that he still needed to pursue this peace in the hope that some sort of reconciliation might eventually come. The first part of the peace was to take the father of the original victim out into a field and to take a photograph together of the hope of new life that might eventually come. And that was the first piece that was installed in the performance space. They had contacted and invited the father of the young man who had been executed, and he still refused to come. But Zhu Yang, in the performance, took the father of the victim by the hand, drew him into the performance space where furniture from the farmer's home, a simple table and chairs were set for the farmer to wait for the other father to come. There was no reference to the original crime that took place, simply the setting for some sort of meeting and reconciliation to take place. After quite a period of time, and there was no return, no coming by the other father, Zhu Yang came in, took the father of the original victim by the hand, and escorted him out of the space. So what does this performance mean? When asked whether he was satisfied with the performance piece, Zhu Yang said, "This work isn't over. It won't be until they reconcile. I will continue to keep in touch with them. I don't know how many years it will take. I might have to wait a lifetime until I'm able to hold hands with the elders of both families." And then he continued, "I'll say it again, artists should return to their role as priests. The priest is that person who stands between man and his fellow man, and between men and God. In this work, I wanted to express a number of questions. In our spiritual lives, we are missing a form of love that goes beyond the carnal. If we each judge others from a position of moral superiority, by what standards do we determine our own righteousness?" I'd like to close tonight with a final thought from the Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei that seems to also apply to how Zhu Yang sees his work. If my art has nothing to do with people's pain and sorrow, what is art for? That seems to sum up at least the problem that we saw Evan Osnos identifying in The Age of Ambition. The question of belief, which more fundamentally seems to have to do in China with what do people live for? Thank you.